They say a recovering alcoholic running a bar is like a pyromaniac running a fire station. But for me, it was the only way to look the devil in the eye and win. My name is Arthur. I own the Alibi. I don't touch the spirits anymore. I just watch how they move other people. I've learned that every patron who sits at my mahogany bar is a locked door. And usually, the person sitting at the opposite end of the bar is holding the key. My bar isn't a place for parties. It's a place for people who are at the end of their rope and just want to hold on to the knot. I've spent 5 years perfecting the art of the pair. I watch, I listen, and I stir the room like a drink. I've fixed marriages, solved lawsuits, and ended feuds, all by sliding a specific glass to a specific person at the right time. But on this rainy Tuesday, the air in the bar felt different. It felt like a storm was coming inside. At the far left sat Leo. He was 34, nursing a club soda with lime, his eyes fixed on a notebook he hadn't written in for months. Leo used to be the city's top investigative reporter, the kind of man who could make a mayor sweat. But a year ago, he'd been broken. A source died, a story collapsed, and Leo lost his nerve. Now, he was a ghost haunting my bar, looking for a truth he was too afraid to find. At the far right sat Clara. She was new, but she had the look. The look of someone who had just seen a monster and realized it was sitting in her own office. She was a forensic accountant, the kind of woman who saw the world in spreadsheets and tax codes. She was staring at a manila envelope as if it were a bomb. Her hands were shaking so hard she couldn't even pick up her water. She had the evidence, but she had no one to tell. Between them sat 12 empty stools and a lifetime of missed opportunities. I polished a glass, watching the reflection of the rain on the window. If I did nothing, Clara would walk out and disappear into a witness protection program or a shallow grave. Leo would walk out and eventually stop coming back altogether. They were two halves of a broken machine, and I was the only one who knew how to put them back together. I didn't start with a conversation. I started with a drink. I poured a mocktail, a blend of ginger, honey, and spice, and slid it down the bar toward Clara. "On the house," I said softly. "It's good for the nerves." She looked up, her eyes wide and glassy. "How did you know?" I just smiled and pointed toward the other end of the bar. "The man at the end of the rail? He's been looking for a reason to pick up his pen for a year. I think you're holding it." Clara looked at Leo, then back at me, her face a mask of suspicion. "I don't know who you are, Arthur, but I can't talk to anyone. It's too dangerous." I leaned over the bar, my voice a low, steady anchor. Danger is just a story that hasn't been told yet. Leo is a reporter. He doesn't care about the money or the politics. He cares about the truth. And right now, you're the only person in this city who has any. I walked down to Leo's end. I didn't say a word. I just set a small, empty inkwell on the bar in front of him. He looked at it, then at me, his brow furrowing. "What's this, Artie?" I nodded toward Clara. "That woman is an accountant for the Sterling Group. She's currently deciding whether to burn that envelope or burn the city down. She needs a voice, Leo, and you used to be the loudest one we had." Leo turned his head slowly. He saw Clara, saw the envelope, and saw the raw, jagged terror in her eyes. For the first time in a year, I saw the reporter wake up. The slump in his shoulders vanished. He picked up his pen. "What's in the envelope, Arthur?" he asked. I shrugged, walking back to the middle of the bar. "Why don't you buy her a drink and find out? But keep it quiet. The walls in this city have ears, and most of them work for Sterling." It was the perfect match. Within 10 minutes, they were sitting in the back booth, the envelope open between them. I watched them from the bar, the alchemy beginning to work. Leo was leaning in, his face intense, taking notes with a feverish speed. Clara was talking, her hands finally still as she offloaded the weight of her secret. They weren't just fixing their problems. They were falling into a rhythm that looked a lot like destiny. But the Alibi isn't a fortress. The door chimes rang, and a man in a charcoal suit stepped in. He didn't look like a customer. He looked like a cleaner. He didn't look at the bar. His eyes went straight to the back booth. I felt the old urge to reach for a bottle, to drown the panic, but I gripped the bar rail instead. "Can I help you, friend?" I asked, my voice as cold as the ice in the bin. The man ignored me, walking toward the booth. Leo looked up, his eyes narrowing. He recognized the man. It was the same security consultant who had threatened his source a year ago. The man who had broken Leo's career. Clara tried to hide the papers, but it was too late. The cleaner reached for the envelope, his hand steady and silent. "The Sterling Group would like its property back, miss," he said. The air in the bar turned to ice. I didn't use a gun. I didn't use a punch. I used the one thing a former alcoholic knows better than anyone: the power of a distraction. I accidentally knocked a heavy glass pitcher off the bar. The shatter was deafening. In the second the cleaner turned his head, I whispered to Leo, "The back door. The alley. Take my car." Leo didn't hesitate. He grabbed Clara's hand, snatched the envelope, and bolted toward the kitchen. The cleaner lunged after them, but I stepped in his way, a wet floor sign conveniently under my arm. He went down hard, sliding across the polished mahogany floor. By the time he stood up, the sound of my old sedan roaring to life echoed through the alley. They were gone. I stood behind my bar, breathing hard, my heart hammering a rhythm of pure, sober adrenaline. The cleaner looked at me, his face a mask of rage. "You just ended your business, old man." I didn't flinch. I just picked up a clean rag and started wiping the spot where the pitcher had broken. "My business is second chances," I said, looking him in the eye. "And I think yours just ran out of time." As the cleaner stormed out, I looked at the empty stools where Leo and Clara had been. The heist had begun. They were going to bring down Sterling, and I was finally going to settle the debt that had driven me to the bottle 20 years ago. The cleaner disappeared into the rain, but I knew he wouldn't go far. I pulled a hidden burner phone from beneath the cash register. "They're on the move," I said into the line. "Destination: the old press building. Make sure the lights stay green." I wasn't just a bartender tonight. I was the conductor of a symphony 20 years in the making. Leo and Clara thought they were running for their lives, but I was leading them exactly where they needed to be to strike the heart of the beast. I locked the front door of the Alibi and flipped the sign to closed. For the first time in 5 years, the bar was silent. I sat on the stool Leo had vacated and looked at my reflection in the mirror. 20 years ago, I was the one with the envelope. I was the one who trusted the wrong person and lost my family, my career, and my sobriety to the Sterling family's greed. They thought they had buried me in a bottle. They didn't realize I was just fermenting. My car's GPS pinged on my tablet. Leo and Clara had reached the safe house, a basement apartment I'd kept in my brother's name. I watched the feed from the doorbell camera. Leo was standing guard, his jaw set, while Clara paced the room, clutching the manila envelope. They looked like two soldiers who had just realized they were in the middle of a war. "Arthur," Leo's voice came through the intercom I'd installed. "We're here." "But we aren't safe." I saw 2 more cars. "Listen to me, Leo," I said, my voice calm through the speaker. "The envelope contains the digital encryption keys for Sterling's offshore accounts. If you can get that data to the server at the press building, story goes live automatically. The police, the SEC, the public, everyone sees it at once. Sterling can't kill 1 million readers." I heard Clara gasp. She hadn't realized the magnitude of what she'd found. She wasn't just an accountant. She was a whistleblower for a global empire. "How do you know what's in here, Arthur?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. I looked at the bottle of expensive scotch on the back shelf, the one I kept as a reminder of my failure. Because I'm the one who wrote the original ledger, Clara. 20 years ago, I was Sterling's head of finance. I was the one who built the cage you're currently trapped in. I've spent 2 decades waiting for someone with your courage to help me tear it down. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. I had just revealed myself as the ghost in the machine. "You're the one they called the accountant?" Leo asked, his voice filled with a reporter's recognition. "The one who vanished before the first trial?" "I didn't vanish," I replied. "I was erased. But tonight, we're writing ourselves back into the story. You have the keys, Leo. You have the voice. Now, you just need to survive the next 2 hours." The sound of tires screeching echoed through the intercom. "They're here!" Clara screamed. I watched the screen as the black SUVs pulled onto the curb. This wasn't just a retrieval team. It was a small army. Sterling wasn't playing legal games anymore. He was going for total erasure. "Leo, the back vent!" I shouted. "It leads to the subway tunnel. Go. Don't look back. Use the subway pass I put in the glove box. It's registered to a dead man." I watched them disappear into the darkness of the basement, just as the front door of the safe house was kicked off its hinges. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained steady. I stood up and walked to the back of the bar, pulling a hidden lever behind the gin. A section of the mahogany wall slid back, revealing a high-tech surveillance hub. The Alibi wasn't just a bar. It was a command center. I had spent 5 years wiring this city for this exact moment. I tapped into the city's traffic camera system. I saw Leo and Clara emerge from a subway entrance 3 blocks from the press building. They were running, their breath visible in the cold night air. Behind them, 3 men in suits were closing the distance. "Turn left on 4th, I whispered, even though they couldn't hear me. Suddenly, a taxi pulled up alongside them. The door swung open. "Get in," the driver yelled. It was Miller the baker from my street. Miller wasn't just a baker. He was another soul I'd paired with a second chance a year ago. He owed me, and tonight, he was the getaway driver. I watched the taxi swerve through traffic, blocking the pursuit cars with a precision that would have made a stunt driver jealous. 1 mile to go, I noted, my fingers dancing across the keyboard. I began the bypass protocol for the press building security. I was opening the gates for the truth. The taxi screeched to a halt in front of the press building. Leo and Clara bolted for the doors, the manila envelope held tight against Clara's chest. The security guardsmen I'd personally vetted and placed there months ago stepped aside to let them through. "Top floor, room 402, I said into Leo's earbud. They hit the elevator, the doors closing just as Sterling's lead cleaner reached the lobby. The heist was in its final, most dangerous phase. On the 40th floor, the room was filled with the hum of servers and the glow of blue LED lights. Leo sat at the main terminal, his hands finally steady. Clara stood over him, her fingers flying as she entered the final encryption codes from the ledger. "It's working," she breathed. "The files are uploading. Arthur, we're at 40%. I watched the progress bar on my own screen, the amber light reflecting in my sober eyes. "Keep going," I urged. "Almost there." Suddenly, my surveillance screens went black. One by one, the cameras across the city flickered out. "Arthur, what's happening?" Leo's voice was frantic. "The system is crashing." I looked at my console. A massive counterhack was being initiated from a location I didn't recognize. Sterling had a second ghost. Someone with more power than I'd anticipated. Someone is cutting the power to the building, I realized. They're going to trap you in there. The lights in my own bar flickered. I looked toward the front door. A silhouette stood there, a man in a tailored gray suit holding a silver cane. He didn't look like a cleaner. He looked like the devil himself. It was Sterling. The man who had destroyed my life 20 years ago had finally come to collect the final debt. He didn't use a gun. He just tapped his cane on the wood. "Hello, Arthur. I see you stayed sober. Pity. You're going to want a drink for this." I stood behind my bar, the mahogany between us like a shield. "The upload is at 60%, darling," I said, my voice a cold, jagged edge. "In 10 minutes, your empire is a memory." Sterling smiled, a slow predatory expression. "And in 5 minutes, this building will be a pyre. I've already authorized the emergency demolition of the press building. Your little reporter and the accountant are sitting on a bomb." Was their second chance really worth their lives? I gripped the edge of the bar until the wood groaned. Sterling stood there, leaning on his cane, the epitome of a man who believed the world was his to burn. "They're innocent, Sterling," I rasped. "This was between us." He let out a soft, mocking sigh. "Everything is an expense, Arthur. People are just numbers on a balance sheet. And tonight, I'm balancing yours." He checked his watch, his eyes gleaming with a sick, patient joy. I looked at the black monitor. I couldn't reach Leo and Clara. The signal was jammed, but Sterling had made one fatal error. He thought I was playing the same game we played 20 years ago. He thought I was still the man who followed the rules. I reached under the bar and pulled out a small crystal decanter filled with a clear liquid. I poured 2 glasses. "A toast, then," I said, my voice eerily calm. "To the end of an era." Sterling raised an eyebrow, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his face. "A drink? After all these years?" "I thought you were a man of principle, Arthur." He reached for the glass, his fingers brushing mine. To the winner, he toasted, bringing the liquid to his lips. He took a long, arrogant sip. I watched him, my heart slowing down to a cold, steady rhythm. "It's not gin, Sterling," I whispered. "It's the solution to your second ghost." Sterling's eyes went wide. He tried to speak, but his voice was a choked rasp. The liquid wasn't poison. It was a highly conductive chemical compound I developed with a chemist friend. Another second chance I'd paired years ago. "The silver in your cane," I said, pointing to the metal grip. "It's a perfect conductor. And you're currently standing on the wet spot where I accidentally broke the pitcher earlier. The heist isn't just in the press building, Sterling. It's right here." I hit the silent remote in my pocket. A low-voltage current surged through the floorboards, traveling through the liquid and into Sterling's cane. It wasn't enough to kill him, but it was enough to seize his muscles. He collapsed onto the mahogany, his tablet sliding across the bar. I snatched it. This was his master control, the device that was jamming the press building and authorizing the demolition. "Now," I hissed, "let's see who's really on the balance sheet." My fingers flew across his tablet. I bypassed his biometric lock using the latent prints on the glass he'd just touched. I canceled the demolition order with 3 seconds to spare. I felt the vibration of a distant thud, the sound of the charges being disarmed. "Arthur, the lights are back on." Leo's voice crackled through my headset, filled with a manic, terrified hope. "The upload is at 85%. We're almost there." "Finish it, Leo," I shouted. I looked down at Sterling, who was twitching on the floor, his eyes full of a helpless, silent rage. I didn't feel pity. I felt a profound sense of clarity. I turned the tablet toward the bar's mirror, activating the front-facing camera. "Sterling, say hello to your shareholders." I didn't just upload the files. I started a live stream from his own private device, broadcasting his paralyzed, defeated face to every monitor in the Sterling group. Upload complete, 100%. The screen on my terminal turned a brilliant, solid green. Across the city, news tickers began to scream. The evidence was everywhere. The bribes, the murders, the offshore billions, it was a digital wildfire that no amount of money could extinguish. Leo and Clara had done it. They had survived the night, and in doing so, they had given the city back its soul. I looked at the bottle of scotch on the shelf. I didn't need it. The adrenaline was pure. I heard the sirens approaching. Not the private security cars, but the real police and the feds. I unlocked the front door of the Alibi. The rain had turned into a gentle mist, the neon sign of the bar reflecting in the puddles like a promise. Leo and Clara arrived 10 minutes later, breathless and soaked to the bone. They didn't look at the man on the floor. They looked at me. Clara walked up and hugged me, her tears warm against my shoulder. "You're safe now," I whispered. Leo stepped forward, his notebook tucked under his arm. He looked like the man I'd seen in the old newspaper clippings, strong, clear-eyed, and dangerous. "He's gone, Arthur. The empire's falling. I just sent the final article to the editor. It's titled The Alibi." I smiled, a tired, genuine expression. "It's a good name for a story, Leo, but I think Second Chances fits better." The feds led Sterling away in handcuffs. He didn't look like a devil anymore. He just looked like a frail, broken man in an expensive suit. He looked at me one last time, his mouth opening as if to speak, but he had no words left. I watched him go, the weight of 20 years finally lifting from my shoulders. The debt was settled. The bottle stayed closed. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly, completely sober. The Alibi became a landmark after that night. Not for the drinks, but for the history. People started coming from all over the country, hoping for a pair of their own. Leo and Clara stayed in the city. They didn't just fall in love. They became a powerhouse team, the reporter and the accountant, a duo that the corrupt feared more than the law. They still came to the bar every Tuesday, sitting in the same booth where it all began. I stayed behind the bar, polishing the same mahogany wood. I didn't need a command center anymore. I didn't need hidden levers. I just needed the people. I watched a young man walk in, his eyes darting with the same fear I'd seen in Leo. He sat at the left. A woman walked in 5 minutes later, her shoulders slumped with the weight of a secret. She sat at the right. I smiled to myself and picked up a clean rag. I poured a mocktail ginger, honey, and spice and slid it down to the woman. "On the house?" I said. "It's good for the nerves." She looked up, startled. "How did you know?" I pointed toward the man at the end of the bar. "He's looking for a reason to start over. I think you're holding it." I walked away, the chemistry of the room beginning to stir. I wasn't a pyromaniac running a fire station. I was a gardener, and the garden was finally in bloom. As the sun began to rise on a new Tuesday, I looked at the reflection of the neon sign in the window. The Alibi. It wasn't just a place to hide anymore. It was a place to be found. I took the bottle of scotch off the back shelf and walked to the alley. I poured the liquid into the drain, watching the gold disappear into the dark. I didn't need the reminder anymore. I had the truth. And the truth was the best drink I'd ever had. Months passed, and the scandal that had rocked the city became a case study in corporate accountability. But for me, the victory was quiet. I spent my mornings sweeping the sidewalk, watching the neighborhood wake up. The white SUVs were gone, replaced by city transit and bicycles. I was no longer the man hiding a secret command center. I was just Arthur, the guy who served the best mocktails in the district. But I knew that even in peace, the world was still full of people needing a bridge. Leo and Clara walked in at their usual time, but today they weren't carrying envelopes or notebooks. They were carrying an invitation. "It's the first annual Whistleblowers Gala," Clara said, her face glowing with a health I'd never seen before. "They want you to be the keynote speaker, Arthur. They want to hear from the man who designed the cage and then built the key." I looked at the invitation thick, cream-colored paper with a gold seal. "I don't belong on a stage," I said. "You belong wherever people need to hear that they can come back from the dark," Leo insisted. He looked at the bar rail where he had once sat in a slumped, broken heap. "If you hadn't slid that empty inkwell across the wood, I'd still be a ghost, Arthur. This city doesn't just owe you a thank you. It owes you its ears. I looked at my hand, steady and clean. Maybe the final step of my recovery wasn't staying behind the bar. Maybe it was stepping out from behind it. The gala was held in the same hall where Sterling used to host his private fundraisers. The irony was thick enough to taste. I stood backstage, wearing a suit Clara had practically forced me into. My heart was doing that familiar rhythmic roll, but it wasn't the panic of the heist. It was the weight of the truth. I reached into my pocket and felt a small, smooth object, the silver cap from Sterling's cane. A reminder that even the strongest metal can be a conductor for change. Ladies and gentlemen, Arthur Moretti. The applause was a physical wall of sound. I walked onto the stage, the bright lights blinding me for a second. I looked out at the sea of faces, lawyers, journalists, accountants, and ordinary citizens. I saw Leo and Clara in the front row, holding hands. I cleared my throat, the silence that followed feeling like the moments before a storm. "My name is Arthur," I began. And for 20 years, I was a man who believed in the bottom line. I believed that people were numbers, that secrets were assets, and that power was the only currency that mattered. I built systems to hide the truth because I was afraid of it. I looked at the crowd, my voice growing stronger. But the truth has a funny way of outlasting the lies. It survives in the archives, in the ledgers, and in the hearts of the people who refuse to be silenced. I lost everything to find that out. But in the end, I found the only thing that actually adds up. "A second chance isn't a gift you're given," I said, leaning into the microphone. "It's a debt you pay to your future self. It's the choice to stop running and start building. I'm here today, not as a hero, but as a man who finally learned how to be a neighbor." When I finished, there were no cheers, at least not at first. Just a profound, heavy silence that felt like the city finally exhaling. Then, the room exploded. It wasn't the sound of power. It was the sound of hope. After the speech, a young woman approached me. She looked no older than 22, her eyes rimmed with red. "Mr. Moretti?" she whispered. "My father was one of the men your evidence helped exonerate. He died before he could see it, but thank you for giving us our name back." I took her hand, the gratitude in her voice worth more than every offshore billion sterling had ever hoarded. This was the real dividend of the heist. The human won. We returned to the Alibi late that night. The neon sign was humming, a steady pink glow against the midnight sky. Leo, Clara, and I sat in the back booth, the same one where the alchemy had started. We didn't talk about Sterling or the court cases. We talked about the future. "I'm starting a foundation," Clara announced. "A non-profit for forensic analysts who want to work for the public good. No more private firms. No more consultants. And I'm heading the investigative bureau for the new independent press," Leo said. "We're going to call it The Ledger." He looked at me, a witty glint in his eye. "We'd like you to be on the board, Artie. Every paper needs a moral compass, especially one that knows how to spot a fake from across a room." I smiled and raised my water glass. "I think I've spent enough time in boardrooms, but I'll be your first subscriber." The weeks turned into months, and 2026 brought a sense of stability I hadn't felt since before the bottle. The Alibi was no longer a secret command center, but it remained a sanctuary. I had hired a young man named Elias, not a Vance or an Elias from the stories, just a kid who needed a job and a place to belong. He learned the mocktails, he learned the rhythm of the floor, and he learned that the person sitting on the left usually needs the person on the right. One Tuesday, a man walked in wearing an expensive linen suit and a look of absolute ruin. He sat at the far end of the bar, looking at the wood as if it were his own gravestone. 5 minutes later, a woman walked in, her heels clicking a sharp, desperate beat. She sat at the opposite end. I looked at Elias and gave him a small, knowing nod. "The ginger honey spice?" he whispered. "Exactly," I replied. I watched as he slid the glass down the rail. I stood at the middle of the bar, a clean rag in my hand. I wasn't orchestrating a heist anymore. I was just maintaining the garden. I watched as the man and the woman eventually looked at each other, the bridge beginning to form. They were the new pair. They were the new second chance. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The man looking back was clear-eyed, graying at the temples, and finally, completely at peace. Leo and Clara arrived for their weekly booth meeting. They looked like a couple who had walked through fire and come out forged in gold. "Big news, Arthur," Leo said, setting a fresh copy of the ledger on the bar. The final assets of the Sterling Group were just liquidated. Every cent is being used to fund city schools and hospitals. The empire is officially dust. I picked up the paper, the headline reading, "A New Day for the Second Chance City." I looked at the neon sign reflecting in the dark Atlantic rain outside. The Alibi. It wasn't just a bar anymore. It was a testament. A place where the broken became whole and the silent found their voice. I reached under the bar, not for a lever or a phone, but for a small leather-bound notebook. I wrote down the date, January 25th, 2026. The books are balanced. The garden is in bloom. The heist is over, and the truth is finally home. The bell above the door chimed, and I looked up from the notebook. It was a man I hadn't seen in years, a former detective named Silas, who had been forced out of the force when he tried to investigate Sterling's early bribes. He looked at the bar, then at me, a slow grin spreading across his face. "I heard a rumor that the accountant had retired and opened a church," he joked. I gestured to a stool. "Not a church, Silas. Just a place where we stop pretending we aren't all human." Silas sat down, his eyes scanning the shelves. "The city feels different, Arthur. People are actually talking to each other in the elevators. They say the Moretti effect is more contagious than the scandal ever was." I poured him a glass of sparkling water with a twist. "It's not an effect, Silas. It's just what happens when you remove the static from the line. People want to be good. They just need to know it's safe to try." He took a sip and nodded. "Safe. That's a word I haven't used in a while." We sat in a comfortable silence, the kind only two men who've seen the dark can share. "I'm starting a private security firm," Silas said eventually, "but not for the corporations, for the whistleblowers. Leo told me you might have a list of names, people who did the right thing and lost their careers because of it." I reached under the bar and pulled out a small, encrypted drive. "I've been curating that list for 5 years, Silas. These aren't just names. They're a ready-made army of integrity." Silas took the drive as if it were made of glass. "This is the true treasure of the Sterling heist, isn't it? Not the billions, but the people." I leaned against the back bar, looking at the photos of the neighborhood I'd pinned to the wall. "The billions are just paper. These people are the ink. Without them, the story doesn't mean a thing." Silas stood up, adjusted his cap, and gave me a sharp, respectful salute. "I'll see you next Tuesday, Arthur. Keep the water cold." As he left, I noticed a young woman standing by the window, watching the rain. She had been there for an hour, never ordering a drink, just staring at the street. I walked over with a small glass of warm cider. "The rain in Philly always looks like it's trying to wash something away," I said quietly. She didn't turn around, but I saw her shoulders drop an inch. "Some things don't wash away, Mr. Moretti. They just sink deeper." I set the cider on the sill. "Then you have to learn how to swim." She finally looked at me. Her face was young, but her eyes were ancient. "I work for the city council. I found something in the archives, something about the new transit contracts. It's happening again, isn't it? Different names, same game." I looked at the streetlights reflecting in the puddles. "The game never ends, but the players change. And this time, you have an alibi." I pointed to a business card on the table, Leo's direct line at the ledger. "Call him. Tell him Arthur sent you." She took the card, her fingers trembling slightly. "Why are you doing this? You already won. You could just enjoy your bar." I looked at the empty glass of cider she'd already finished. "Because a garden doesn't stay in bloom unless you keep pulling the weeds. And because I promised a man 20 years ago that I'd never let the static take over again." She nodded, a new spark of resolve in her eyes, and walked out into the mist. I watched her go, another seed planted in the second chance city. Leo and Clara were watching the interaction from their booth. "You're never going to actually retire, are you?" Clara teased. I walked back to the bar, picking up a cloth to polish the mahogany. "I am retired. I'm just a bartender." Leo laughed, tapping the morning paper. "A bartender who just provided the lead for our next front page story. The transit contracts? We've been sniffing around that for weeks. That girl was the final piece." I just shrugged. "The alchemy never stops, Leo." "Speaking of alchemy," Leo said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "Sterling's son is back in town. He's trying to rebrand the family name through a philanthropy fund. He's calling it the Sterling Legacy." I stopped polishing. The name felt like a cold draft in the room. "He's his father's son," I said. "He thinks a new coat of paint can hide the rot." Leo nodded. "He's clean on paper, but the money in that fund is coming from a shell company in Singapore." I looked at the silver cap of the cane in my pocket. The war was over, but the watch continued. "Does he know about the alibi?" I asked. "He knows the name," Clara replied. "But he thinks you're just a relic of his father's past. He doesn't realize you're the one who wrote the playbook on how to beat him." I smiled, a witty, sober glint in my eye. "Then let him keep thinking that. Arrogance is a legacy, too. And it's the only one that always pays its debts." "We're on it, Arthur," Leo said, sliding into his coat. "The ledger is tracking the Singapore wire. If it's dirty, we'll know by Friday." They left the bar, a powerhouse team that the city now relied on to keep the lights bright. I stood alone in the quiet of the Alibi. The neon, reflecting in the dark Atlantic rain. I realized that my recovery wasn't a destination. It was a journey I took every single day. And every day, I chose the truth over the bottle. I walked to the back of the bar and pulled out the old ledger one last time. I didn't open it to the encrypted pages. I opened it to the very back, to a list of names I'd started writing on my first day of sobriety. Leo, Clara, Miller, Silas, and now, the girl from the city council. Each name was a bridge. Each name was a second chance. I added the date, January 25th, 2026. The static is rising, but the signal is stronger. We are ready. Elias, the young man I'd hired, came out from the back room, wiping his hands. "Everything's prepped for tomorrow, Arthur. The ginger is fresh, and the honey is local." I looked at him, a kid who had come to me 6 months ago with nothing but a bad reputation and a willingness to work. Now, he was a master of the mocktail and a trusted ally. "Good work, Elias. You ever think about what you want to do next? Beyond the bar?" Elias paused, looking at the mahogany wood he'd spent hours polishing. "I think I want to do what you do, Arthur. I want to learn how to hear the silence." I felt a swell of pride. I wasn't just planting seeds. I was growing gardeners. "The silence tells the truth, kid. Everything else is just noise." We turned off the main lights together, the bar settling into a comfortable, watchful dark. The Alibi was closed, but the watchman was wide awake. I walked up to my small apartment above the bar. The windows overlooked the city, a sprawling map of millions of stories, all intersecting in the dark. I sat in my favorite armchair, a cup of herbal tea in my hand, and watched the dawn begin to break over the Philadelphia skyline. The heist was a memory, the empire was dust, and the bottle was empty. I was Arthur Moretti, a former alcoholic, a former accountant, and the luckiest man in the world. Friday arrived with a heavy slate gray sky. Leo and Clara were already at the bar before the lunch rush, their faces pale. "You were right about Sterling's son, Arthur," Leo said, sliding a digital printout across the mahogany. "The Sterling Legacy Fund isn't for philanthropy. It's a vacuum. He's using the city's new transit contracts, the ones the girl from the council mentioned, to siphon public funds back into the family's frozen accounts. It's a mirror of his father's first move." I looked at the data. It was beautiful in its cold mathematical cruelty. Julian Sterling wasn't just his father's son. He was a refined version. He wasn't using thugs or cleaners. He was using green initiatives and social equity as a shield. "He thinks he can buy the city's forgiveness while stealing its future," I said. Clara tapped a line of code. "The problem is, the transfer is legal. On paper, it looks like a standard management fee. We can't stop it with a headline." "Then, we don't stop it with a headline," I said, a slow, witty smile spreading across my face. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver cap of the cane. "We stop it with the fine print." I looked at Elias, who was listening intently. "Elias, go to the cellar. In the back, under the old wine racks, there's a crate marked 1922. Bring it up." As Elias hurried away, I turned back to Leo. "The Sterling Group still uses the original bylaws from the 1920s, and those bylaws have a moral turpitude clause." Elias returned with a dusty leather-bound book. I flipped to the very last page, where a signature had been faded by time. "My grandfather was the original auditor for the Sterling family," I revealed. "He didn't just keep the books. He kept the insurance. This clause states that if any Sterling heir uses company funds for personal gain while a legacy debt remains unpaid, the entire fund reverts to the trust of the defrauded. And Julian just forgot to pay one person." "Who?" Clara asked. I pointed to the business license of the bar. "The Alibi. 20 years ago, his father borrowed the startup capital for this building from my pension fund. He never paid it back. He thought I was too drunk to remember. He thought the debt died with my career." I looked at Leo, the light of the final heist in my eyes. Julian just authorized a $10 million transfer. According to this clause, he just accidentally signed over his entire legacy fund to this bar. The witty reversal hit like a thunderclap. Julian Sterling had spent millions to rebrand his family name, but by ignoring the petty debt of a former employee, he had triggered a legal landslide. "We don't need a whistleblower," I said. "We just need a claim." Clara filed a lien of heritage. Leo prepared the story. Not as a scandal, but as a historic settlement. We aren't going to fight him. We're going to collect. By 5 p.m., the digital transfer from the Sterling Legacy Fund was diverted. It didn't go to Singapore. It landed in the newly formed Alibi Trust. Julian Sterling arrived at the bar 10 minutes later, his linen suit perfectly tailored, his face a mask of aristocratic fury. He didn't bring a cane. He brought a team of lawyers. "You old drunk," he hissed, slamming his hands on the bar. "You just committed the biggest act of wire fraud in the history of this state." I didn't move. I just finished pouring a club soda for Leo. "Check the bylaws, Julian. Page 402. Your father's signature is right there. The debt was never settled, and the interest over 20 years. Well, it turns out your legacy fund was exactly the amount required to balance the books." Stephen Taylor's lawyers know. Julian's lawyers gasped as they scanned the leather-bound book. "He's right, sir," the lead counsel whispered. "The clause is ironclad." Julian looked at the bar, the mahogany reflecting his own stunned expression. He had been outplayed by a man who didn't even own a computer. "You can't do this," he stammered. "That money was for you," I interrupted. "But now it's for the city. The transit contracts are safe. The schools are funded. And you, Julian, are officially out of the family business. I suggest you find a new alibi. This one is full." As Julian was led out by his own legal team, realized they couldn't win, the bar erupted in a quiet, satisfied laughter. The heist was truly finally over. I looked at Leo and Clara. They looked like they had just seen a miracle. "You did it again, Arthur," Leo said, raising his notebook. "The account strikes one last time." I shook my head, wiping the bar with a clean rag. No, the bartender just finished his shift. The Alibi Trust became the biggest benefactor in Philadelphia's history. We didn't keep a cent of the $40 million. Every dollar went back into the streets, the parks, and the second chances. I stayed behind the bar, but the sign outside was updated. Underneath the neon A, it now read, "Where the books are always balanced." Elias became a full partner, his social alchemy growing sharper every day. The years would continue to roll on, and the name Sterling would eventually become a footnote in a larger story of a city that found its way back to the light. Leo and Clara eventually married. Their wedding reception held right here between the mahogany and the mirror. They didn't want a ballroom. They wanted the place where they were found. I poured the toast, a vintage ginger honey spice, and for a moment, the room felt like a perfect, completed puzzle. I sat on my favorite armchair in the apartment above the bar, the sound of the city a low, peaceful hum below me. I picked up my notebook and wrote the final entry. January 25th, 2026. The debt is paid. The signal is clear. The garden is in full bloom. I am Arthur Moretti, and for the first time in 20 years, I am not looking for an alibi. I am home. I closed the book, turned off the light, and slept a deep, sober sleep. The next morning, I opened the doors at noon. The sun was reflecting off the sidewalk, the air fresh and clean after the rain. A young man walked in, looking lost. He sat at the far left. A woman walked in 5 minutes later, looking like she'd been holding her breath for a week. She sat at the far right. I smiled at Elias and nodded toward the ginger. The alchemy was beginning again. And as always, the last round was on the house.